So after, you see Sid getting tucked in and assuming he grows up to be a kind man, I can kind of reflect back. So the character arc is somewhat common, and that it's kind of a narrative of a lesson learned story. But I think Looper does this very originally. It's not just kind of like, and then I learned to be, a happy man and live ever after. Old Joe never sees it, and remains unwavering in his decision to kill his way back to his wife until the end of the movie, which contributes to him being a static character. One of the last things Old Joe does is kill Abe, the man the mob sent back in time to run the Loopers. It's revealed earlier in the movie that it was Abe that turned young Joe's life around. Rather than killing him for robbing one of Abe's stores, Abe put a gun in his hand and turned him into a Looper. So Joe's final act in the film is to save... young Joe's final act in the movie is to save Sid, who somewhat portrays Joe's son and also is kind of a younger version of Joe's self. So we kind of see these two acts cross and come together with the killing of the father, Abe, by the unchanged Bruce Willis, who never sees it, and the saving of the son, or the younger self, by young Joe, who does see it and does finally dynamically change. The scene, though, where Old Joe actually kills kills Abe is great, and I'd like to explicate it a little bit and go more in depth with some analysis. So the moments before we see this, they're filled with Old Joe going on a violent rampage through Abe's headquarters. An hour and 39 minutes into the film, we see Old Joe on Abe's security camera from inside his office. It's in black and white and has those typical little numbers and the date in the corner and, live feed 1. And it's in black and white, so we are watching this and it's completely zoomed in on the screen. Abe comes to see who that is. He recognizes Old Joe and says, "Holy shit." Directly after this, camera flips 180 degrees and shows Abe and, two men and his kind of bodyguards in his office. They flip a table over, draw their weapons, and then the camera kind of immediately zooms in, which makes the room seem much smaller. It feels kind of claustrophobic and makes the feelings of like someone's coming very real. The colors and lighting in here are very dark. Abe's dull yellow clothing is the only color we see, until a few moments later when we see Joe's face, which is splattered with dark red blood. And like I said previously, both of these films had somewhat of a noir style. So, most of the indoor scenes in the movie are dark and lacking in color. There's a few highlights here and there, but not too much. The camera hovers over Abe's face which is stricken with panic. Then that piercing, score from, all tense moments in all movies kind of pops in and begins to play, and this adds tension. Abe shouts out, "Joe, just like your goddamn ties." Abe shouts out, "Joe, just like I put the gun in the kid's hand. I guess everything comes back around." Then he quietly mutters to himself, "Just like your goddamn ties." The camera cuts to Joe. He slowly turns his bloody face towards Abe's office, and then we see Old Joe head towards Abe's door on the security camera. But the camera zooms in on the door so that we lose perspective on that security camera. And then all we see is the door get kicked in, and then that scene ends and cuts. So another instance of an anticlimactic scene. It cuts to a wounded member of Abe's gang. He gets up and walks into Abe's office and sees that, it appears Old Joe killed everyone, including Abe. In terms of style, like I said, it's anticlimactic. And it's similar to the way Johnson chose not to explain time travel. He, simply lets it happen. It doesn't matter how. Old Joe improbably killed all of Abe's Gatmen. He did, and Johnson feels he doesn't owe us an explanation. It becomes clear later that these actions needed to be necessary to continue the loop of events. If old Joe was killed or failed in this action, then the loop that they're stuck in would never happen. The story would cease to exist. So perhaps if this pertaining to the multiverse theory, perhaps this is just one of many dimensions. There's other dimensions and where the odds, won the day and Joe died or Joe failed. But in this story, he made it through this obstacle, and the story kind of carries on. But it's also important because Abe makes two comments here. The first reference Abe inhabiting the father figure role to Joe when he first gave him his gun and showed him how to be a looper. This pertains to the fathers and son theme, which I'll discuss a little later on. He also references another major theme that everything comes around, and then mentions Joe's ties. Early in the film, Joe is always dressing in nice ties, which Abe mocks him for, and he says he's just imitating past generations and not being original. So just like fashion trends repeating over and over, events and actions have far-reaching consequences, which, if we live long enough, eventually come back around. So, that's definitely one of the major themes, that everything comes around. You see a lot of cause and effect. Like I've discussed a little bit with the loops. Old Joe's action of killing a kid's mother causes his wife to be killed in the future. There's this interconnectedness, kind of similar to Buddhist ideas of how everybody and everything is related. It's kind of like this hip karma, which I really like. You see things come full circle, and kind of means a lot. Another theme is kind of mothers and sons. There's a moment where Joe is talking to a prostitute about his mother and how she ran her fingers through his hair. And later in the movie, after Joe dies, we see Sarah doing the same thing to him in the field. We also see Sarah touching Sid's toes as she walks by in this specific way. And we also see old Joe's older wife he meets in China do the same thing to him. So we kind of see this important relationship with mothers, and they always have this very important healing impact where, it took the woman to save old Joe and get him off drugs and get him out of the gang life and fix him up. And, it took Sid's mother, to kind of raise him right and to avoid having him become the rainmaker by her not dying, in theory. So that's kind of highlighted. There's this kind of cool thing of, fathers and father figures creating either monsters or heroes. Abe created a monster by, creating, a killing machine in Joe. And that eventually kind of relates back to one of everything coming around, that the guy that creates the monster will eventually be killed by the monster. And it kind of goes on to be like this fatherly resentment where, old Joe had a quiet life in China. He was content and completely lost the, idealism of the youth, or he lost the expectations of this grand on the edge, crazy life. So in some ways that kind of relates to the resentment a lot of us feel at, expectations we have from life, resentment of what should be ours, what we missed out on, changing sensibilities. And, it's all like a really cool way that he works all of these different themes into a lot of different ways. Just to jump back to the fathers and sons real quick. So, Abe's a father figure to young Joe. Old Joe then kills Abe, who created the monster. Young Joe is kind of the father figure to Sid, and if he does the fatherly thing by killing himself, then, Sid becomes a nice guy and nobody else dies. But if young Joe hadn't done that, old Joe ends up killing Sid's mom, so then Sid orders old Joe's death, which ends up killing the woman that saved old Joe's life, his wife. And then there's also kind of another play on that where, the young men loopers are killing their older selves, which then plays into the resentment. So there's this really cool mesh of themes that really plays out. In terms of mood, tone, and style, like I said, it's fairly anticlimactic. It's also, very dystopian. The future's not a good place to be. And like I've also said, it's got a lot of noir-esque feel to it. The film is dark as it deals with murder, abandonment, and drug use, but it's also optimistic. It's not dark for dark's sake, and it's not uncomfortably dark the way some macabre films can be. I also felt that the film was very realistic. Like a lot of movies in the 80s, they were like, 20 years in the future, here's all this like flying car, megacity, robotic craziness. This film's set 30 years in the future, but it's just, slight differences. Cars are adapted to run on solar power. There's some technological differences. But other than time travel, it's kind of exactly what I would think of 30 years in the future. So I mean that's cool, and I really liked that it was realistic. The lighting is, I would say, for the most part, it's very natural outdoor lighting. It's also fairly soft. There's a lot of pastel colors. For most of the outdoor scenes, there's a lot of like backlighting. And like a lot of times that lighting fills all of the camera's perspective, where it's like you looked into the sun and then it kind of moves. That kind of looked great, but it also kind of clashed with the dark indoor scenes where there weren't any kind of obvious sources of light. But all of the optimistic moments kind of happen outside, so like that's kind of lit differently than a lot of the pessimistic action that happens inside. So that was kind of cool.